minutos. Wait, what? We're live? Welcome to Quiplash 3 Awakenings. Schmitty's my name and gentle sarcasm is my game. Let's go. By the way, if you didn't get in the game, you can still vote as an audience member. Type in the room code to join. And now, round one. I'm going to flash 2 prompts on your device. Type something ingenious that will stand up against another player's response. Then, everyone will vote for their fave, and one of you will get an ego boost. Points are scored based on the percentage of people who choose your response. Let's quip! Time's running out. All right, let's begin. How about we start with, who knew police give tickets for blank? Vote away. Okay, what's next? You know your date is a slob when you find blank in the middle of their living room. Time to pick the one you like best. And next is the best marketing slogan for your butt. Decisions, decisions. Choose your favorite. Let's see how they handle. Name a snack food for mummies. Okay, choose your favorite. Alright, check this out. Your fish are bored. You should put a blank in their tank to amuse them. And now, pick your favorite. And here we have what every woman is hiding under her bangs. And now it's time to vote for your favorite. Round one is in the books. Let's see how the scoring shakes out. So if round one was an appetizer, round two is a substantial meal. Double the points, double the indigestion. time's winding down. Use a safety quip if you have. Okay, let's see what you've wrought. First, but not necessarily best, is... Serious question. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Have at 'em. Let's see the next one. You know somebody stole this player's credit card when there's a charge for blank. Okay, everybody, pick your favorite quip. And next, to get past the internet troll under this bridge, you must answer this riddle. All right, people, it's voting time. Next up, Spider-Man's secret guilty pleasure. All right, choose your favorite. And now, all the jesters have failed. Only one thing will entertain the king. Now it gets real. Pick your favorite. Without further ado, an absolutely scathing review for an eraser. Here's the fun part. Pick your favorite quip. Round 2 is no more, but how did you score? I'm sorry, that was not... Get ready for Quiplash, a no-holds-barred quipaganza. I'm going to send each of you a prompt that requires 3 separate responses. That's triple the ha-has. Tick-tock, time's almost up. Let's proceed, shall we? Three things you want to touch right now. All right, vote for the one you like best. Kids are made of things like sugar, spice, and everything nice. What are adults made of? Okay, choose your favorite. Based on your deeds, the three most likely things you'll be reincarnated as in your next life. Time to pick the one you like best. Nothing to do now but see those final scores. This is Quiplash 3, Funny versus Clever. Schmitty here, and you're there, so that means you all found the secret map. Great! Don't look now, but it's round one. Oh yes, points. You score points based on the percentage of voters who like your answers. Clear enough? Sure hope so. Let's go. Tick-tock, time's almost up. Okay, here's where the fun starts. Kicking things off, the best response to "I know you are, but what am I?" Okay, shower someone with points. Next one up. Remember, kids, if it doesn't have blank, it's not anime. All right, people, it's voting time. Next we have, there is no I in team, but there is an I in blank. And now pick your favorite. Moving right along, a great name for a superhero who can communicate with cats. Okay, everybody, pick your favorite quip. Let's keep it going. One thing someone could whisper in your ear to win your heart forever. Now it gets real. Pick your favorite. Next, California's biggest export is blank. Here's the fun part. Pick your favorite quip. Round one is done, but not forgotten. Let's check the score. Okay, round two is knocking on the door. Prompts are a little more challenging, so the points are doubled. Time's almost up. Use a safety quip if you're stuck. Your entire lives have led to this moment. And here's your first prompt. The most intriguing phrase to find in a dating profile. Okay, pick one. Next we have what Ronald McDonald dreams about. Decisions, decisions. Choose your favorite. Without further ado, what's an interesting fact on Stephen King's resume? And now it's time to vote for your favorite. And next, the title of this player's Masterclass series. All right, choose your favorite. And next is the worst part about having Tom Hanks as your mortal enemy. Here's the fun part. Pick your favorite quip. Moving right along. I want to go as this player for Halloween, but I don't have blank. Okay, choose your favorite. And round 2 is history. Let's see how it'll be remembered. And now for Quiplash, where points flow like honey. Okay, it's thrip time. The 3 words that best describe your current mental state. Okay, everybody, pick your favorite quip. The 3 things every good orgy has. And now it's time to vote for your favorite. The 3 questions you must ask yourself before starting a podcast. Now it gets real. Pick your favorite. Take a deep breath and behold the final scores. And now for a little thing we call Quiplash 3. Quips Reloaded. If you've played this game before, you know that my name is Schmitty, and I'm basically harmless. It's the prequel to Round 2, Round 1. You'll rake in the points based on the percentage of people who dig your response. Got it? Great! Almost out of time. Don't forget your safety quips. It's quip time. And going first is... Nobody ever checks into that hotel room, not since blank. Pick a winner. All right, check this out. A terrible sound option to have on a white noise machine. Decisions, decisions. Choose your favorite. Next one up, the dish that gets you uninvited from future potlucks. All right, people, it's voting time. Let's see the next one. Relationship rules: never go to bed angry and never wake up blank. Time to pick the one you like best. Let's see how they handle. Modern pirates don't steal treasure, they steal blank. All right, vote for the one you like best. Next up. Quick, how do you ruin a romantic picnic? And now, pick your favorite. I took a locket of round one's hair to remember it by. Let's look at the score. Get yourselves ready, because round two takes no prisoners. Double the points, double the anxiety. You're almost out of time. Don't forget your safety quips. I hope you didn't embarrass yourself. Let's break the ice with a solid pickup line for a hockey player. Voting time. And now, the worst name for a home security company. Now it gets real. Pick your favorite. Okay, what's next? A podcast nobody could resist would be about blank. All right, people, it's voting time. And here we have, right before open heart surgery, improve your odds by telling your doctor blank. Here's the fun part. Pick your favorite quip. Next we have the best way to convince fast food customers to get a value meal. Okay, everybody, pick your favorite quip. Moving right along. What Santa's elves do when the old man is sleeping. And now it's time to vote for your favorite. And round 2 is finito. Let's see if the same is true of your score. Welcome to Quiplash. And behold, a final round to end all rounds. Just a few seconds left. Are you ready for magic? The 3 most important rules of your own private tickle club. Time to pick the one you like best. The 3 things you see right before you die. Decisions, decisions. Choose your favorite. The 3 worst Halloween costumes to make sexy. All right, choose your favorite. You rocked it! But did you rock the scoreboard? Well, howdy do. It's Quiplash 3, Cruise Control. I'm Schmitty. You'll be hearing my voice throughout the game, unless you put me on mute. Time for round 1. Points are awarded based on the percentage of people who went for your answer, so make them count. Time's running out. Safety quip it if you have to. Sure hope you got your answer in on time. So, how do you think you did? Let's see. Up to bat, we have an unlikely spokesperson for vaping. It's choosing time. Let's see the next one. Dogs are so gullible, they actually believe blank. Okay, choose your favorite. check this out. A nickname for a big bushy beard. Nothing like running unopposed. Here's some points. Next up, a surprising new use for kale. All right, vote for the one you like best. Without further ado, the one thing you should never put in a communal fridge. We've got a no-show. Well, more points for you. Next one up. Before marmalade, Paddington Bear had a crippling addiction to blank. Okay, everybody, pick your favorite quip. Now that round one is a distant memory, let's move on to the score. Round two is here, and the points are doubled, so stop talking about round